So before I hand over to Dr. Eric Carlin, who will be chairing today's session, I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank the team at SHAAP for all their hard work in arranging this seminar series and producing this really excellent report. And as I understand it, some terrific media coverage today, including front page of the Scotsman. Particular thanks have to go to Jackie and Liz, and also to all of our speakers and seminar participants that enabled us to produce such a rich account of the key issues surrounding men and alcohol. So I'll now put you in the capable hands of Dr. Eric Carlin, who's very kindly returned for the day to his position as Director of SHAAP from his seconded post at the World Health Organization that I'm sure he'll enlighten you on now. So do enjoy the session, and I look forward to a discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katherine, and welcome everybody to the launch of what I think is going to be a very important and influential report. Can I please refer you to your joining instructions, and also specifically to be sure that you can see any PowerPoint slides during presentations. So that's the technical instructions. Just to say that the timings for today are approximate, but we will finish no later than 4 p.m. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to return temporarily from my post with WHO. I was in post at SHAAP as director when these seminars took place and when the report was being written, as well as when the previous seminars on women and alcohol took place. And I'd also refer you, if you haven't seen the report on those seminars, to go to the SHAAP website and to compare the findings in relation to women and alcohol and men and alcohol. It's interesting for me looking at the two reports today that actually the men and alcohol report is longer and in more depth. That's quite an interesting finding. Huge congratulations to Jackie MacDiarmid, to Katherine Severi, and to Lindsay Patterson, the interim SHAAP Director, and to Liz Hurst-High for all working together to produce such an excellent report, I think, for putting this very popular event together today. I think we had about up to 140 people signed up, although they're obviously not all on here yet, and for gathering substantial media interest that we've been noting today. Just a few opening comments to make before moving on to our programme, and just to reassure you that we will both be allowing plenty of time for people to participate and to ask questions. I do want to just note that the seminar will be being recorded, so please take that into consideration in terms of if you're taking part in what you want to say and whether you want to kind of show your video. While you are saying whatever you're saying. So first of all, I just want to make a general point about gender. For a range of reasons that have been hypothesized, very often I think when we talk about gender, we actually talk about women. And I'd suggest, and I'm not unique in suggesting this, many people have said it far more eloquently and with far more of a research background than I have. I suggest it is particularly the case when we're talking about health issues, and even more so when we're talking about stigmatized or stigmatizing behavior, such as, for example, drinking too much and behaving in non-acceptable ways related to drinking too much. And so I think that this discussion that we are now having is very important in opening up discussion of gendered relationships and practices related to alcohol, but with men being the focus. I'm not really aware of actually this having been done before. Maybe somebody else knows more than I do, but I think this is a fairly unique piece of work that we've been doing. When we held these seminars, we therefore deliberately had all male panels of speakers, and you can rest assured that if I turned up at an all male panel and that hadn't been a deliberate tactic, I would have actually raised it. So we had men on our panels. We challenged them to share personal perspectives, and we asked them to include where that even might acknowledge things that they and we might not be comfortable with. So we wanted them to think about themselves as men and to think about their own relationships to alcohol and avoiding othering in the discussion, and recognizing that whether we're professionals, whether we're counsellors, whatever we're doing, wherever we are in our lives, we all have complex and dynamic relationships with alcohol the most socially sanctioned drug that we have. And I have to say that we're really grateful that without exception, our speakers rose to that challenge, and we're very grateful. And we'll be hearing from a selection who have kindly rejoined us today. So the report has a series of recommendations which we'll be going through and discussing, and Jackie will be guiding us mainly through that. Just to say a number of things that specifically jump out to me. First, COVID, and I'm not going to say much about that other than we don't know what impact COVID will have in the long term on people's drinking and people's harmful drinking. But there's certainly a good chance that inequalities will worsen, and we know that inequalities are related to harms from alcohol. Secondly, that strategies to prevent and reduce alcohol-related harms need to be contextualized, I think, within a rethinking of what it means to be a 21st century man. And that includes thinking about how we relate to each other and how we relate to women and other genders. And it includes recognizing and celebrating and working with our complexities, our vulnerabilities, and our failings. Third, in relation to interventions that are likely to be effective in reducing harms, that I think that we know, and we just have to constantly underline, that population level measures, including interventions in markets and regulation, are going to be the most effective ways in reducing the harms that alcohol causes across all of our populations, including men and including the most vulnerable men, women, and other genders. And my final point in relation to kind of issues from the report is that recovery is possible and that many of us are celebrating it and achieving it. So having kind of made those general comments, I will give instructions in relation to the questions and answers after we've heard from the speakers. But I'm now just going to pass on to Professor Carol Emsley, a great friend and colleague of me personally and also of SHAAP from Glasgow Caledonian University, who's going to summarise key themes in infographics that she's produced related to Scotland and England, gender and alcohol, and which we're delighted to launch as part of this report. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Eric. And as someone with a long-standing interest in gender and alcohol, I'm really delighted to be here at the launch of this excellent report. It's really well written, really well thought through, a really clear report on men and alcohol today. So thank you for organising that. On the topic of men and alcohol, just before I go on to the infographics, I was really pleased to find out yesterday that the Institute of Alcohol Studies are funding my colleague, Dr. Elena Dimova, to do some work on drinking among new fathers, so bringing together evidence on the impact of pregnancy and becoming a father on men's drinking. And I think we've had so much work on mothers and alcohol, so I'm really pleased that this neglected area of alcohol and fatherhood is going to be looked at. So thank you for that. So today what I want to do in just a very few minutes is to quickly flag up our updated infographics on men, women and alcohol, which are published at the back of this report, and which I'll also be tweeting today under the hashtag men and alcohol, which we're using for the session today. We've got two versions of the infographics. If you could just stay on the first one, thank you, Jackie. We've got two versions of the infographics, one with stats for England and one for stats for Scotland, so that hopefully it's useful for people across Great Britain. I'd like to say thank you to my co-authors, Professor Niamh Fitzgerald and Dr. Deborah Shipton, who helped me to develop these. So what we wanted to do with looking at men, women and alcohol was really to draw attention to gender stereotypes associated with alcohol. And first of all, of course, these stem from wider gender norms in society. And we know about gender double standards. We know that men's behaviour when drinking is judged less harshly than women, and that men are more likely to be excused for the behaviour if they've been drinking. So we need to look at these wider gender norms. We also need to look at the role of the media. And our research has shown that the UK media still very much associates binge drinking with women, despite the fact that men still drink more and are still more likely to binge drink. So this underplaying of men's drinking is likely to have an impact on the public's perception of where the problem lies. And of course, finally, the role of the alcohol industry here, the way that alcohol is marketed to men. And Gerard Hastings, who spoke at one of the previous events, has talked about how Carlin, for example, quote, celebrates, initiates and promotes the togetherness of the pack, their passions and their pint, through sponsoring football, music and everything else that brings the lads together. So I think it's important to look at the way that alcohol is marketed to men. So the bottom line of our infographics really is that while the gender gap in alcohol-related harm is closing, men still drink more and experience more problems than women. And we've tried to illustrate this through using some statistics. So if we can have the next slide, please, Jackie. So with regard to hospitals, for example, we know that alcohol-specific hospital admissions in men are twice as common as in women. And if we move on to deaths, we know that alcohol-specific deaths in men are double that of women. And finally, consumption. So we know on average, male drinkers in England consume 15.5 units of alcohol per week. And of course, we know that the guidelines advise not drinking more than 14 units, compared to 9 units for women. And the stats are similar for Scotland. So if these are useful to you in your work, in your research and your policy work as service providers, I'd encourage people to please download and tweet from our website, genderandalcohol.co.uk. And as I say, they're also published at the back of the report, and I'll tweet them during this meeting. But thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other contributions today. Eric.
Thank you, Carol. I suggest that we hold our questions until we've heard from the speakers, unless there's something burning that can't wait till then. So if that's okay, I'd like to now pass on to Kevan Christie, who is a health journalist who has kindly come back to join us. Kevan spoke at the first seminar on men, alcohol and identity, and he describes himself as a typical working class Scottish man who has grown up with a love of football, which was overtaken by a love of drinking. So Kevan, we would like your further reflections, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a wee bit woefully unprepared for this, but I just find that speaking from the heart helps. As I say, I'm the health journalist with the Scotsman, but also, and probably more importantly, typical working class Scottish guy from Leith in Edinburgh. I've been sober for 2 years. I decided to give up drinking. I'd had enough, but I'm very much, I can talk about the culture of what I would describe as functioning alcoholics and guys that regularly go down the pub. I got myself a sponsor, and I'm in AA, and I've gone through the 12-step program, which I found hugely beneficial to me. My experience of the pub culture was, like I say, functioning alcoholics. And when I spoke at the seminar, which was a privilege to do, I touched on initially there is a sense of belonging and shared experience with men. And that can be close friends, like growing up, you'll go to the pub together as teenagers, and there's a rite of passage thing, and that's well recognised. But latterly, towards say that like the last 10 years of my drinking, I'm 51-year-old, I would seek out fellow problem drinkers, and without consciously speaking about it, I was aware that the other people I was drinking with were also heavy drinkers. And we never really touched on this. As I say, there's a lot of people that were like functioning alcoholics. So although there was that sense of having a stressful job and then going to the pub, there was also this sort of appeasement where we were allowed to drink to excess. And this could be highlighted in the most extreme ways. And I remember somebody dying early in the pub, like a guy, he's in his early 60s, he got pancreatitis and he died very quickly within 6 or 7 weeks. And nobody spoke about the amount that he drank. You know, that was never touched on, which I thought was bizarre. And then we had the wake, and that was back at the pub that everybody drank at, and that ultimately killed them. And this is a sort of fatalistic thing that you get in Scotland, where, especially with middle-aged men, there's a reluctance to recognise the problem, and they drink to sort of fatalistic levels, where they'll know they have a problem, but they don't care anyway. It's the sort of thing that you maybe see. I remember growing up, and I've heard this and spoken about in health a lot, is the train spotting generation. That's guys around my age. It's more of I suppose it's more of a drug thing, and you'll all be aware of it. As I say, I'm not academic, so I just talk like off the cuff here. And the train spotting generation, which is more involved with the drugs, but you also see it with the drink. And a lot of them are a lot of these guys who are around my age are starting to die off. But I mean, so perhaps that gives me a sense that there may be hope for a younger generation. But the things that attracted, I mean, I very much grew up in the culture of going to the football and then going to the pub. Everything revolved around the pub. Every single occasion was marked by drink. If there was football on the telly, if you had a good day, you had a bad day, you went to the pub. Constantly, it just become like a revolving door. That became your living room. And I think one of the ways I've since taken myself out of that environment, and I'm not in touch with these people that I thought were my friends, and they're not in touch with me. So it's very much a marriage of convenience, if you like, that you seek out these, and you tend to find each other problem drinkers, because you'll be the people that are in the pub until closing time. And it was always men. It was always like a group of men standing at the bar. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what pub culture's like post-COVID, given that you can't crowd at bars and that kind of thing. And in a way, I mean, what I certainly can't speak for is the most deprived people in society. I can't speak for people that drink in the house and how the effects of lockdown has impacted on them, because my culture was the pub culture. But it may be that in some cases, and Eric already touched on it, it's too early to tell whether COVID's a good or a bad thing. But just off the top of my head, I suppose some of these guys they're kind of forced to spend more time with their family, which could be a good thing, hopefully. There seems to be, because health is at the forefront now, given what's happened in COVID, possibly people are looking at a more holistic approach, like the whole thing, like giving up smoking, give up drinking, this chat about your immune system, you've got to be ready. So hopefully that may have an impact. I'm just thinking about alternatives for men's identity. And I'll finish up on this, but what I also found is giving up alcohol, in a lot of cases, it's helped me become a bit more of a sort of positive role model, but only for people that want that. I'm shunned by people that are still using alcohol, and they don't want to hear about your recovery. They're not interested in that. And I don't bore people with my so-called recovery, but you're like a pariah. I would never dream of going to the pub and not drinking in that specific company. I mean, I do now. I don't mind going to the pub and having a non-alcoholic lager, but it's a social thing, and there's a reason why I'm there. It's not purely to consume alcohol, and I think with men like myself or what I was like in that group, they don't really care about each other. It's more that they are not drinking on their own, and as I said before, they facilitate each other, if that makes sense. That's really all I've got to say. Is that okay?
Kevan, that's more than okay. Thank you very much. Again, to just really appreciate the fact that you've actually chosen to kind of share some personal stories, which I think are really important, and we would consider that as evidence, not only for the nature of the problem of alcohol in society, but also about how recovery can be supported. So thank you very much for that, and for all the work you do generally and shine in your journalism work in terms of shining a light on these really important issues. So I'm now moving on to reflections from Habib Kadiri, who works for the Institute of Alcohol Studies and who took part in the session on marketing. The note that I have in relation to Habib is, as a lifetime teetotaler, he wonders why Vimto. For those of you who have been uninitiated to Vimto, it's a sugary soft drink, which is probably not great for your health. But Habib wonders why Vimto is not grown up enough for most people. So Habib, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, you're right. It's not that good for the teeth, but relatively speaking, it might be okay. So yes, I spoke at Alcohol and Marketing and Men and Alcohol Marketing, and I was going to just reflect for those who weren't there on that occasion on what I said at that time. Bearing in mind, I have not seen my notes from that time either, so this might be just as much of a shock to me as you. But I think what I said was just generally about me growing up and how I came to not drink as opposed to got into drinking. So I marked out 7 points that I raised. Firstly, that despite the fact I'm teetotal, marketing doesn't escape my attention completely, and it didn't when I was a kid. You know, in my formative years, my parents drank, and also growing up, I would obviously be perfectly aware of all different types of advertising, and you know, some adverts would really stick in the memory better than others, and some of those was alcohol, were alcohol adverts. And then going on to the second point, as a teenage boy, marketing's grip was most powerfully observed through the network effects of a famous advert I would see. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be an alcohol advert, but sometimes it would be, you know, an advert for a chocolate or something like that. So although there were many brands that were all competing for attention, the way that alcohol seemed to work, especially in my teenage years, coming up to the age of being legally permissible to drink, alcohol worked by being that new product that my peers would, so to speak, grow into as we're becoming adults. But going on to the third point, what happens there is that personalities are forged and defined by brands. So as someone who saw this happening and thought, for whatever reason, I just thought, this not for me, I become classified as a teetotaler, and as a teetotaler, I become acutely aware of being left out of those occasions in which those personalities are being forged and defined by brands. And there's also an element of masculinity that is forged around brands as well. So what happens to me is I just become that guy who doesn't drink. And to some degree, it seems as though not drinking and the occasions in which drinking happens as well, usually happens at parties, makes me seem like I'm no fun. Jury might still be out on that if you know me. But going on to point 4, there's also another element of me that I would claim as, in some ways, a protective factor, which is that I'm Muslim. And so I also get the assumption that because I'm Muslim, I don't drink. Like I said before, it's an assumption that holds, generally speaking, but Muslims do drink. Some of them do drink, including my parents at the time, and my dad still does. So Islam is assumed to be a prerequisite for being teetotal for me. And I'm able to hide under that. So in that respect, that takes over in discourse about how you define different people's masculinities in regards to myself. But also, there is the issue of intergenerational impacts. So going back to my father, I'm in that crucial sense, by not drinking, as different from him as current generations of people going to university now would be different from me, because my generation happened to be in the UK, the one that was caught in the throes of peak alcohol, as it were. The last consumption peak for alcohol was around about 2003 to 2007, and has been declining since. So when I were at that was exactly the time when I was at university. So I can accept this idea that the kids of today, who are, especially the boys who are becoming men, as it were, today, going to university, say, might have a much different approach to alcohol again, compared with my generation in general. And then the final 2 points I have are that looking today, my tastes as an adult male, and how alcohol tries to cater for them, as in like the things that I like, where does alcohol kind of advertise itself to me to still try to persuade me of the benefits. It seems to me that there's a trend that alcohol marketing is becoming more niche. So it's trying to cater to different types of male drinker. I think I mentioned I mentioned an advert in particular that was it's kind of a strange kind of marker of how things have changed. And I think it was a Coors Light advert, the ones that Claude Van Damme starred in, where, you know, the concept seemed to be this hard man is somehow able to drink a light beer. It's the kind of thing that I don't think would have worked before, but seems to be increasingly working now, because alcohol companies are kind of moving towards trying to persuade male drinkers to drink light beer rather than necessarily, you know, higher strength ones, and still trying to preserve this element of masculinity about them. And then finally, none of this seems to have an effect on me, because I'm happy to just say I don't drink. What's actually more acutely worrying, I think, for myself is going forward having to define myself as somebody who not only doesn't drink alcohol, but doesn't drink alcohol-free alcohol. So for these no alcohol drinks, if it wasn't for, say, COVID, and I'd find myself, say, at a pub with friends, the conversation of somebody who doesn't drink, also not drinking this alcohol, which is now available to drink and there's no which is 0 ABV, is something that, you know, it may lead to, like, you know, some tense moments. But I personally am just not the kind of person who, I think I'm so used to not drinking that kind of drinking alcohol-free alcohol that I'm okay with it. But do I have a concrete set of reasons? Do I have a convenient excuse? I don't really, and it really does come down to choice, and that kind of hits at a particular issue, which is, if somebody doesn't want to drink any type of alcohol at all, what are the ways in which they can be protected, especially in terms of male peer pressure? What is the ways in which they can protect themselves from the kind of pressure that they get from their peers to be seen to be drinking alcohol, well, alcohol, non-alcohol that looks like alcohol. So yes, those were the kinds of points I was raising then. So yes, that's me.
Habib, thank you very much. That's absolutely brilliant. Just a number of themes that I think are kind of coming up through both of those presentations. Alcohol being central to masculine identity. It seems quite an odd thing if you think about that. Why is this drug so central to how we construct notions of ourselves? The alcohol is a social practice, which means that it's enacted within society with other people, and that was very important in terms of Kevan talking about his experiences, and whether people who you're drinking with are facilitating that social practice or whether they're real friends becomes a kind of moot point. And the third point I think was the stigma that really kind of jumped out at me in both of those reflections. That when we talk about women, we very often talk about women being stigmatized. You have the kind of these images of young women on a park bench out of control and really transgressing social roles about how women should be, but almost a suggestion from what both of you were saying, that stigma about not drinking for men may be worse than the stigma of drinking badly. Passing on, as I say, there is plenty of time. There will be plenty of time for further discussion. Please hold your discussion points for after the speakers. So I'm passing on now to another friend and important colleague for myself and SHAAP, of Jardine Simpson, who's excused himself from his numerous TV appearances to join us this afternoon. And Jardine found abstinent recovery through residential rehab and Alcoholics Anonymous. And as director of the Scottish Recovery Consortium, Jardine celebrates and is an example of recovery every day.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Eric. How can I follow that? I just want to thank yourself, Eric, Felicity, Lindsay and Jackie in particular for all the work that's been done, all the work that SHAAP do, but in particular around this Men and Alcohol series. And I want to congratulate IAS and SHAAP on the launch of the report, which I find really timely. Listening to both Kevan and Habib there, Habib, I'm going to embrace my toxic masculinity and tell you that as a recovering Scottish alcoholic, Vimto is knocked into a heartmate by Iron Brew. So come on, you know, get to know your audience a bit better, right? And expand your taste buds somewhat. And I also want to comment on what Kevan was talking about earlier, in terms of his experience of the fatalism of males in particular around their relationship with alcohol. Do you know, I'm in recovery from multiple substance dependency, you name it, and I've had issues with it. And it was quite interesting you were making the analogy with train spotting. You know, more and more now, I think our society is waking up to substance use rather than specific substance use. And yeah, there is a very fatalistic relationship, but there's also that Jekyll and Hyde relationship that goes on with substance use, particularly with alcohol use, you know. And we've already talked about stereotypes and how marketing can be aimed at stereotypes, but the insidiousness of alcohol and the marketing of it is how they can transcend any stereotypes or even any public health emerging evidence that actually lodges itself in the public, and still maintain this toxic relationship that, you know, for light relief from life, a large proportion of people, and particularly males, will reach for the bottle before they would put on their running shoes. And that's maybe something that I'd like to touch on later. When I was part of the seminar we were theming our comments around health, and I was thinking in terms of the context of the launch of this report. So we've got this historical ongoing issue in all of the UK. You know, manhood's unhealthy relationship with alcohol, and despite messaging, health messaging and counterpoint messaging to marketing, it still does prevail culturally in many different ways, depending on class, depending on social circumstance. Alcohol is still seen as a real focal point for life and for connection, but those connections are probably quite inauthentic because they are based on alcohol, and Kevan articulated that really clearly. That's something that I've always been fascinated by, both my own drinking and isolation, even being part of that group of men clustering around the bar. I still felt very, very isolated, but would always seek out the proximity of others to try and justify my behaviour to myself. And also the other thing I want to point out is that there is an absolute, and it's almost becoming systematically accepted under provision of what I would describe as effective alcohol treatment, both from statutory and third sector services. And that's something that I think my hopes for this launch is that the report can actually give us a platform to really start to address in action that very issue. Now, we've already talked about COVID-19 and whether it's too early or to start to draw any conclusions around have attitudes or behaviours changed. I'm not so much interested in the statistics, as Eric will tell you. I can't really count, so numbers kind of leave me cold. What I do recognise the present COVID-19 situation as, we have an opportunity here that is unexpected and very, very, very significant. So if we are looking to have an opportunity to reset culturally and societally, the male relationship with alcohol, what better time to do that than as we come out? And I hate the expression back into a new normal. I really want us all to be thinking about taking this opportunity to build a new reality. And what I mean by that is, you know, a reality where health, well-being and lifestyle are really brought to the fore in a way that, you know, government, statutory organs, public health, we are good at creating the message. How good are we at taking that glossy message and making it real in the lives of the people we're aiming it at? And that's something that brings me, in my role as Chief Executive of the Scottish Recovery Consortium, to lived experience. You know, one of the joys of working with SHAAP is SHAAP's approach as an organisation to people with lived experience, an organisation of professionals that authentically understand people with lived experience to be experts in what works, because they've gone through a transcendent process to move away from dependency and into productive and fulfilling lives. And that's what recovery is, you know, in a nutshell for me anyway. So through lived experience, I think we have an opportunity to address that cultural relationship, the toxic cultural relationship that men have with alcohol. And I was struck by reading the report, Adrian Childs talking about how we can balance between the glossy marketing and advertising approach. And for every glossy piece of advertising, we need to counterpoint that with the stark realities of the harms that alcohol does. Well, yeah, okay. But there's part of me inside my little resentful alcoholic cynical head saying, good luck with that. Eric's already talked about stigma, and Habib talked about peer pressure. Stigma and peer pressure, my contention is the best way to tackle these issues around alcohol, the cultural relationship, is to create a much more proactive and positive counterpoint, to give people an alternative, to educate people, message towards people, but show people and invite people into that new context so that they can experience the benefits we're talking about, rather than wave the finger, you know, and say, no, that's bad for you, because people are going to rebel against that. But we have an opportunity as people emerge from COVID into a new reality to get these men who are all standing in a cluster but not really interested in each other to genuinely find out about the benefits of true connection with other human beings, you know? And that is something that people with lived experience, recovery activists, or as we call them, recoverists, that's something that we're past masters at. It's what our lives are founded on. It's what our recovery depended upon. The connection with other people who had successfully done what we'd done before. So the role of mutual aid, and recently in Scotland, the development of visible recovery communities, of which Scottish Recovery Consortium plays a large supportive role in the development of these visible recovery communities. And the fantastic work that's done by Alcoholics Anonymous all across the country and worldwide. We have an opportunity there where people with lived experience can complement the lack of effective treatment. But more than that, especially through visible recovery communities, we have an opportunity now in Scotland where we have visible recovery communities playing a proactive and very, very positive part in their local communities. Now, they have to do that because they are of themselves, in essence, a recovery community. They're not a service. They're not a service provider. They are a community of people. And that's wholly founded on the principle developed by the 12-step fellowship, right? That's connection, authentic human connection, right? And from that, a good recovery cafe or recovery community offers recovery capital, social capital, right? It offers health and well-being opportunities to people, and it offers an opportunity of socialization and personal development, okay? Now, if those are the three pillars of effective recovery communities, then any of you involved in public health are going to see the benefits that that's going to bring to any local community. And if the entity is also dependent on its connection with the local community, then that entity becomes a node of wellness, you know, and that becomes the positive counterpoint to the negative relationship that we have with alcohol, and especially for men, because what men are very, very bad at is asking for help, right? What they are very, very good at, certainly in recovery circles, and I'm sure my fellow recovering alcoholics or alcoholics will agree, is dominating the meetings. Once they get used to the fact of they've asked for help, and once they get used to the fact of opening up and sharing, you can't shut us up, you know? Now, that can be a positive, okay? Because there is a substantial cadre of men all across Scotland who, through that transcendent process of recovery, have been able to embrace their own emotions and be able to articulate them to other men and women in a way to norm that positive behaviour. And again, from there, we have other opportunities to develop things like a holistic approach to health and well-being. Every recovery community in Scotland, right, because of COVID-19, has really developed the idea of going out for a walk, okay, a recovery ramble, a mobile walking recovery meeting where people talk about how they're doing, how they're feeling, what they're thinking, but they do it in the fresh air. They do it on the move. They are ambulant, they are mobile, they are healthy, they are well. These are the kind of opportunities that my organisation wants to really reconnect back into treatment services, because for me, that's really what we have to do. We have to address the inadequate treatment that people who develop dependency on alcohol receive. And if hard-pressed alcohol treatment services can't afford to spend time dispensing psychosocial support, then why don't they collaborate with the other group of experts, people with lived experience, to provide that whole holistic package? And for me, for my organisation, and for many, many people across Scotland in recovery, we really welcome this report because we see it as a platform to make that point. So thank you.
Jardine, thank you very much. As ever, incredibly wise words, covering so much. I love the recovery ramble, and I'm kind of thinking that that's what we're on. Are we on a recovery ramble? And this is part of that at a population level, not just in terms of individual kind of local things that are going on. So that leads on very well to Professor Ian Gilmore, who I think has been on his own recovery ramble. He has been a champion and a leader of evidence-based alcohol policies in the UK over a substantial period of time, including as chair of the Alcohol Health Alliance. But he confessed that he was actually a late convert to the potential of public health medicine and taking a population approach. So Ian, we really welcome your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and apologies for my scary look. Well, Eric, Katherine, and anyone involved in this initiative, congratulations on an excellent report. When I read the report last night, I just couldn't believe how incisive and eloquent I'd been at that seminar in June, till of course I realized it was the editors who made it into that. I'm going to differ from the other speakers, as I shan't be sharing with you much about my own experiences with alcohol, but maybe I should have done, as I've seen huge changes in society, particularly in male society, over my lifetime and its relationship to alcohol. That's the time since I first sneaked into a pub around the age of 15 or 16. I was born in the nice end of the second most deprived city in Scotland, Dundee, and was brought up in a city closely affiliated to Scotland in its drinking habits, Newcastle upon Tyne. I remember in holidays at the age of 16, I would take the bus with friends to the Lake District to climb, and we would buy a child's ticket for age under 14, and at the other end we'd fall straight into the pub. But moving on to wider fields, I think the events of 2020 will always be defined and remembered in the context of COVID, and I think alcohol harm will be no different. We will be seeing events, I think, through a COVID lens for a long time. Our seminar was to be on March the 20th. I escaped from a ship on the River Nile 48 hours before then, escaped with 30 minutes to spare. The occupants of a nearby ship were evacuated and quarantined in a military camp in the middle of the desert on the Libyan border. One way of doing it. Quite rightly, and with prescience, because I don't think lockdown had quite started formally, Katherine and Eric postponed the event, moving it to June, and by then virtual meetings were becoming well established. However, our event on June the 3rd looks very different to me from the first three seminars, looking at the photographs in the report where there's lots of social interaction, smiling, joking. Indeed, they look so happy. I just wondered, to quote my Presbyterian minister grandfather, whether drink had been to seminars. But it underlines to me what is missing in Zoom meetings, but I know we're making the best of a difficult circumstance day. Our fourth seminar, I think, had the toughest task prophesying the future. And we were already 2 months into lockdown, so it was not surprising that the lens of COVID was brought out early on, and concerns were expressed about the impact of this. I think it's even clearer now than it was then that more lives are likely to be lost through the collateral damage of alcohol than from the direct effects of COVID. And these deaths and harms will be linked to mental illness, to suicide, and to reduce access to support and treatment services. And this will be, of course, on a backdrop of an economic recession, social isolation, and yet widening inequalities. And while these are not gender specific, it is likely that the effects will be greater in men, because starting from a higher baseline of harm, the economic aspects particularly hitting heavy industry and traditionally male jobs, and an environment where it's going to be more difficult to effect cultural change. So I think for all these reasons, it's even more important to implement the eminently sensible and practical recommendations of this report. But to do so, we're going to have to persuade our governments to implement public health policies based on sound evidence of efficacy, and to invest in the treatment services. And both those asks will have economic benefits as well as health benefits if we can get that message over. I thought Eric made a really crucial point in his introduction regarding the context in which we're launching this report, the 21st century. The role of men in society has changed out of all recognition in my lifetime, and we know already that there are differences across the age spectrum. We have tended to stereotype men's drinking and the resulting harm as young men binge drinking and the violence ensuing. But in fact, we know that older men drink much more often. They probably drink more. They're more likely to be drinking quietly at home, and they're also less able to cope with alcohol. They often have comorbidities. They're often less able to cope with alcohol because of medications. I remember an ITU consultant, he was president of the Intensive Care Society, telling me that the problems that ITUs have from elderly people falling downstairs in the evening trying to get to bed. And we all know why they fell over. Of course, we're just one of many voices in this post-COVID era, or the moving in towards the recovery period, so-called. And I think we're going to need to build partnerships and play to shared interests. For example, I think the time of obesity seems to be here, particularly with our Prime Minister. So we need to, I think, build on that with obesity organisations, and also mental health, particularly with the present and the previous states ministers of health. Mental health have been higher on their radar than alcohol, and so I think we need to play into both those potentials. I think we also need to be opportunistic. An example of opportunism is what we're doing at the moment in the Independent Commission on Alcohol Harm, which is being launched next week. This is coinciding with the domestic violence bill going through Parliament, and we're using domestic violence as a hook to bring in the journalists to tell them the wider stories about alcohol-related harm. We're also concentrating on individual stories of people in recovery, families around patients harmed by alcohol, and those communities around those families. So very much trying to tell the story, which is often much more effective than just quoting statistics. Finally, I think we have to be honest about the evidence and realistic about the opportunities. We need to understand the difficulties that our political masters are experiencing on so many fronts at present, and concentrate on the art of the possible. But it does seem to be a time of opportunity, and this report, I believe, is an excellent springboard for action. So I wish you the best of luck with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, very much. Just to say that we are noting all of the points that people are putting up in the chat, and we will make sure that we do have an opportunity to pick those up afterwards. Felicity, I note that you're raising the issue of mental health as being reported in Scotland today. I heard that report on the radio this morning myself about levels of suicide in the Highlands of Scotland being very high, and undoubtedly we need to be looking at how mental health issues and alcohol issues kind of come together to affect individuals and communities, and obviously COVID is going to contribute to those pressures on people. So I'm now passing over to Jackie MacDiarmid, who is the main author of the report and the key mover of this whole process. And we've been really grateful to her. We're really sorry that she's going back to her native Canada, where she will undoubtedly continue a stellar public health career. So Jackie, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That's a really kind introduction. Just bear with me for one moment while I share my screen, and then I will get started. Okay, can everybody see that slide? Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads. So yeah, thanks again, Eric. It's really been a pleasure working on this project during my time at SHAAP. As Eric mentioned at the top of the event, I think what made it quite unique and quite special is that the speakers and participants shared so much of their own personal experiences. So I really thank everyone for that, and I do hope that same spirit came through in the report itself. My presentation has two parts. I'll first be giving a summary of each of our sessions. So we've already heard from our speakers about each of the sessions that they participated in. So I'll just fill in some gaps with regards to a survey of the literature that was done in the report. And then I will go on to our recommendations, which we developed jointly with our colleagues at IAS. So starting with men, alcohol, and identity, I've put in some images in the slides of advertisements, kind of for everybody's amusement, and also just to kind of illustrate some of the points that we're talking about. I think we've been speaking about the evolution of how men are viewed, and I think this advertisement is kind of an interesting example of that. The alcohol industry, or Coors in this case, is clearly trying to widen the net of who they're appealing to and trying to be attractive to the LGBT community and look like they're very, up on these issues, very inclusive, and using all that positive language in doing that. So I think, yeah, it's important to keep an eye on these things. So for this session, we were examining how alcohol plays a role in identity construction for men, how class, culture, and race intersect with alcohol, and then also what alternatives exist for identity construction. And I think that we've touched on all of these issues already today. For me, I think this was one of the most interesting and wide-ranging sessions. We talked about the normalization and the acceptance of men's drinking. And I know Kevan, as he mentioned in his comments today, had some really interesting points about how he felt that in Scotland in particular, but I think this could be said for the UK more widely as well, that there's almost a warped sense of nationalism that comes with being a hard drinker and being able to hold your drink and always being there to buy around, and that alcohol is used as a glue for friendships. And we've spoken about that today already, and that certainly is echoed in Professor Carol Emsley's research. We've heard from Carol today. The research, or the report draws on some of her research about men performing emotional labor and how alcohol is often tied up in this and how it's used to create and maintain friendships. And I think another quote that really stands out for me from this first session was Dr. Harpreet Kohli saying that there's a real poverty of men's emotional intelligence, and that alcohol is often used to kind of as a lubricant for social occasions, and that men feel like they can't, do this kind of socializing or perform this emotional labor for one another in an absence of alcohol. So that was quite interesting. In terms of how class and culture intersect with these issues, I know one of our speakers, Kenny McCaskill, mentioned that he felt that the industrial decline experienced during the 80s left a void, and that would be that same kind of generation, train spotting generation that, again, Kevan mentioned. I think it's relevant there too, where men's identity used to be very tied up to their work and this sense of pride and community. And in these communities where manufacturing jobs or heavy industry jobs no longer exist, alcohol has come in to fill that void and to create that sense of camaraderie. obviously with very detrimental effects. And then two final points I'd like to make that from the literature, which I think are really relevant, are about how alcohol and race and culture intersect for men. The research shows us that ethnic minorities show similar rates of alcohol dependency as the white population in the UK, but they are underrepresented in seeking treatment and advice for alcohol problems. So I think that shows that there's a really clear mandate for services and healthcare professionals to perform more outreach to these communities and to make sure that those services are sensitive and relevant to those populations. And then the second point on this that I think is important is that the evidence shows us that where racism and discrimination is prevalent, the risk of harmful drinking goes up. So that would be what's called escapist drinking. And I think that makes sense when we think about using drinking as a coping mechanism or to self-medicate. When it comes to alternatives, I think, yeah, I'm really happy that we've mentioned this already, and I'd just like to highlight it again. I think, yeah, fatherhood in terms of men's identity is such an important option in terms of creating that alternative identity. And I think it is very telling that that came up again and again during our women's sessions, but rarely came up during our men's sessions. So I think, addressing men's participation in performing emotional labor, in performing care work and parenthood duties, I think all of those things are really relevant and really positive for both men and women, and especially for men in kind of diversifying their options for identity construction. I think that's a really important point. And also that if we invest further in education, skills, recreational opportunities, and make sure that those are accessible, those are other avenues for identity construction for men. This brings us on to our alcohol and marketing session. The points covered here were how alcohol marketing and behavior, or the intersection between alcohol marketing and behavior, or the connection between them, how this affects attitudes towards men, and how alcohol marketing differs in different social and cultural contexts. Few important points here to note that the alcohol marketing and advertising is self-regulated in the UK, and these regulations predate the digital age. So they don't have much teeth, there's not much enforcement, and also there's a big gap when we look at digital marketing, and especially where it comes to young people being exposed to marketing. We don't really have the regulations that we need or the enforcement tools that we need in order to address those problems. And this exposure has consequences. As is mentioned in the report, research by the University of Stirling showed that young people with high exposure to and brand recognition for alcohol marketing were 1.5 times more likely to be high-risk drinkers than their peers who had low awareness. So that was young people between the ages of 11 and 19. And I think the alcohol marketing and advertising has many strategies, as we saw in that last slide with the LGBT kind of targeted marketing. We've come a long way from this current picture that we see, which is obviously, very old school. I think it's from 1952. So we wouldn't see an advertisement like this anymore. We've certainly evolved in our, attitude towards men and our conception of gender norms, but we still do see these sexist images very often, and we see advertising trying to enmesh alcohol with positive environments, with identity capital, popularity, and success. And this all reinforces gender stereotypes. It alienates people who don't drink. So that may be people who don't drink for personal reasons, cultural or religious reasons, but also people who are perhaps on their recovery journey and who are abstaining from alcohol for that reason. So we need to make sure that we're recognizing the harms to those people as well. Okay, on to alcohol and health. So the questions that were addressed during this session were with regards to alcohol and mental health, physical health, and then what we can do to increase awareness of alcohol harms. Again, all things we've touched on already during this session, but evidence shows us men are less likely than women to seek mental health help, and they're also less likely to have their problems identified by primary care physicians. So I think, again, just goes to show that I think further training and sensitivity for our healthcare providers and service providers in order to make sure that men's mental health problems or substance problems are actually picked up and addressed in a manner that's relevant and sensitive to them. This can be particularly difficult for men because we know they tend to have smaller networks and that they're less likely to divulge feelings or mental health struggles. And has already been mentioned today, suicide rates for men are much higher than women. In the UK, men have a suicide rate of 3 times what women have. And my colleague, Chris, sent over an article saying that the other day, it was in The Guardian, saying that the suicide rate for men in the UK is at an all-time high when compared to the last 2 decades. So since 2000, this is the highest it's been currently. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on, given that we know alcohol exacerbates depression and anxiety and is also linked with suicide and self-harm. And men are overrepresented in alcohol problems, so they're particularly affected by this. From the health perspective, as was said at the top of the event, twice as many men die of alcohol-specific causes as women, and they're also very overrepresented in hospitalizations. In England, 2/3 of hospitalizations related to alcohol are men, and in Scotland that stat is even higher at 71%. So all things to bear in mind for addressing these harms. The final session, as Ian mentioned, this session was very different than the others. It was the first of our sessions to take place during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it was very informed by that. And the discussions that we had were related to reducing alcohol-related harms, the future of alcohol policy, and then we also had a lot of discussion about sort of personal responsibility versus government interventions and the role of the state and what's most effective. I think the consensus that our experts brought to that discussion was that really public health policies are our best tools for addressing alcohol harms. Reducing affordability, accessibility, and availability of alcohol are some of the most effective ways that we can minimize alcohol harms. And then, as we'll see in our recommendations, kind of wider tools in order to address inequality and deprivation as well are really important. And I think that brings us nicely into our recommendations for research, policy, and practice. And before I delve into those, I'll just note a little bit further on the context of COVID. Obviously, as Ian very rightly said, we have no way of predicting the future, and we don't know exactly what the impacts of COVID have been entirely, but I think there's initial evidence to suggest that the pandemic has exacerbated problems with regards to social isolation, mental health challenges, increased drinking, and deprivation. And I think given this context, it seems probable or possible that we're heading towards a period of further austerity and of economic downturn, which may in turn lead to higher unemployment, precarious work, and higher levels of deprivation. And all of this may contribute to greater alcohol harms, again, which will affect men the most, given that they're overrepresented in these harms. So bearing that all in mind, I'll turn to the recommendations, which were produced by SHAAP and IAS and are informed by WHO guidance as well. So first, our recommendations for research. So we recommend that the following areas be priorities for further investigation. So this would be masculine identities, including class, fatherhood. Carol's mentioned that she has a product, Glasgow Caledonian has a project that's just been funded, so that's great. Looking into fatherhood, so that's an example right there. Age, sexual orientation, and culture, and how these things are linked with drinking behaviors. More information on the normalization of men's drinking and perceptions around masculinity and drinking. Different cultural and ethnic groups and their experiences of discrimination, stigma, and access to services and how they can be better supported. Same thing with LGBT+ individuals, and I know we had a question about that in the chat, so happy to elaborate further on that during the discussion, but that is included in one of our recommendations, that this is certainly an understudied population and also a population that tends to be at risk of alcohol problems, so we need to make sure that our services are sensitive and relevant to them. Further examination of the intersection between alcohol use and mental health problems, and then evaluations of these interventions and services and understanding how they're effective, how they can be improved, etc. Our first recommendation for policy is that, as Jardine very rightly said, people with lived experience, including family members, must be included in the development and implementation of policies, interventions, and services. These people are experts and their input is absolutely crucial if policies are going to be effective and helpful. Further recommendations, whoops, sorry, lost my place here. Okay, further recommendations for policy. So these are some kind of overarching things in order to address inequalities. So the first is poverty reduction and the introduction of a basic income for healthy living. I feel that that's particularly relevant in the time of COVID and how we've seen so many different sectors of work being decimated by the pandemic. So a basic income could go a long way in addressing this issue. With regards to housing, the adoption of a housing first strategy and trials of managed alcohol programs. With regards to youth services, the provision of activities for young people in order for them to learn skills, develop relationships, and have fun in alcohol-free environments. And then the same is true for people of all ages, youth and adults having accessible entertainment and being able to spend time in alcohol-free environments such as community centers and leisure centers, etc. I think this is really important. And particularly, we need to make sure that these are accessible for people living in deprived areas and also for people living in remote and rural areas where access to these types of recreational opportunities may be limited or difficult to get to because of distance and cost, etc. Further recommendations for policy: raising alcohol prices via taxation and pricing policy, having minimum unit pricing review being linked to affordability and pushing the UK for alcohol volumetric and specific taxation as well, a strengthening of the restrictions on alcohol availability and centralizing the licensing process and imposing greater restrictions on alcohol licensing. Again, another point to bring up in the context of COVID-19, we're seeing some interesting things happening with regards to an increase in telephone ordering of alcohol and online ordering. So making sure that we have the ability to regulate these avenues as things advance there as well is important. Advancing and enforcing drink driving countermeasures and facilitating the access to screening and interventions. And finally, our final policy recommendations are with regards to marketing and advertising. So as I mentioned before, we recommend the end of self-regulation of advertising and marketing by the alcohol industry, and that a separate body take over this. We recommend that it be mandated that alcoholic beverages be labeled with health warnings and ingredients, and that this regulation be enforced. That bans or restrictions be enforced on alcohol advertising, sponsorship, and promotion. And then finally, I think this is a nice example of something positive and something creative, an alternative to alcohol sponsorship of sports teams. And an example of that is the SHAAP sponsorship of Scottish women's football. And I think it's a great example to use because a counter argument or a reply to this issue is often, these teams will suffer if alcohol sponsorship is no longer allowed. But I think it shows that an agency like SHAAP that has a public health background, can play a role in sports as well, and we can get alcohol out of sports, especially when it comes to underage sports, as is the case with the SHAAP sponsorship. So, a positive example. Okay, finally, moving into our recommendations for service providers. We want to ensure that service providers exercise professional optimism. So this means giving everyone who seeks help a supportive and positive environment in order to start or continue their recovery journey. And that means recognizing that people can and do recover from alcohol problems, and they should be supported in their journeys. Services should be trauma informed. Again, they should make use of the expertise of individuals with lived experience, and peer support should be initiated where possible. They should be linked with recovery communities and or fellowships such as an Alcoholics Anonymous. A sort of outreach should be performed, and punitive measures such as delaying or denying treatment if clients miss a meeting should be done away with. Services need to communicate with one another. For example, mental health and addiction services need to make sure that patients are not falling through the gaps or being denied one service because they have a substance issue so they can't get mental health, or vice versa. We hear stories of this all the time, and that needs to be addressed. And finally, services should be reviewed and evaluated. Whoops, sorry. Here we go. Okay, finally, these are our final recommendations for service providers. And that was with regards to education and training. So medical and nursing curriculum should provide comprehensive information about alcohol problems and recovery, including information that's specific to gender and the LGBT community and people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, as we've already mentioned during this session. Medical professionals should be made aware of the available services, and they should also be connected to recovery communities and fellowships like Alcoholics Anonymous. And finally, service providers should receive training on all of the above and should be similarly connected to recovery communities, including 12-step programs such as AA. And that is the end of the recommendation. So just a quick note to credit those images. And then I'll just end my presentation just with a quick plug for our Rubra Matters report launch, which will be on the 23rd of September, which is a Wednesday, 2 to 4 p.m. And that's a chance for everyone to learn about the research that we've been doing on alcohol use and recovery in rural communities in Scotland. And you can find information for that event at that link below or on Twitter, or please feel free to email myself or SHAAP at rcpe.ac.uk as well. Thank you all very much. Thanks.
Jackie, thank you very much for that incredibly comprehensive but clear summary of the report and of the process that we've been through. Do you want to stop sharing your screen now? Yeah. So we now have about 35 minutes for discussion, questions, comments. As you will have noted, we've been having some of these kind of coming in during the course of the session. There's been a discussion in the chat room about particularly the alcohol within the LGBTQ community. And Carol Emsley kind of drawing attention to the fact that SHAAP are funding additional research into looking at access for LGBT people into alcohol services. Can I call on, I think Felicity had a point specifically in relation to suicide, and I think related to suicide and isolation, particularly in rural communities, and how alcohol may be connected with that based on some news stories that have been coming out today. So Felicity, can I invite you to unmute yourself? And you need to unmute.
That program this morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it just seemed to make sense what I'd heard when I heard Kevan in particular talking about, standing at the bar with his friends and not really, knowing them, or him not really knowing them. And of course, we all know that men generally, I think as Jackie mentioned, have more difficulty talking about their emotional lives and things that really are important to them. But I think when you think about it, the more you drink, the less focused you become, don't you? And the more it's difficult really to concentrate on anything. So perhaps in some way we need to foster the idea that alcohol is not the best thing that's conducive to sharing your problems or sharing your emotions. Yes, you can have fun, but when it gets down to the serious stuff, and I mean, nothing is more serious than somebody who's thinking of taking their own life. Alcohol is not the right way of doing it, but I don't know what vehicle we would use to get that point across without sort of seeming to be pointing fingers and telling people what to do. That was all really.
Thank you, Felicity. Can I invite Phil Kane, who was one of the speakers on one of the previous sessions and who's raised this point, I think, which is about how to not shame non-drinkers. Phil, would you like to kind of offer some comment as you put up something in the chat? Not putting you on the spot here.
It's putting my technology on the spot, but I shall switch on now. I think you can hear me at least anyway.
Yes,
yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to just raise, because I kind of write for an audience some of whom have influence maybe in government, some of them providing services, but also just ordinary people. And I was just wondering whether any on the panel might have some recommendations for what could be done by ordinary people to enable men to have a better relationship with alcohol. And one thing that just occurred to me as people were talking then was that perhaps, you know, not shaming people who choose not to drink, you know, and making that a kind of issue that we can all sort of engage with. Obviously, it's not gender specific, but I think men in particular struggle, as I think Kevan Christie mentioned, with this, you know, alienation you get after you stop drinking for whatever reason. I think that, you know, that may be one thing that could perhaps help people, but I just wonder whether people on the panel might have some other ideas that ordinary people out there who might read this report or hear about this report could implement themselves.
Okay, does somebody from the panel wish to pick that up? Kevin, do you want to pick that up? Please, everyone, either raise your electronic hands or do that if you want to be, for me to see you.
Yeah, I think the points that Jackie touched on it, but it was Jardine that really raised the issue, talking about this stuff being rooted in the community, you know, grounded in the community. So being able to go to places in the community. And when he was talking, I was writing things down. I loved that rambling thing that he was talking about. And I wrote down the word yoga, and I wrote down the word Monroe's. And I thought, if we can get into that, doing that kind of thing, you know, taking away for this idea that the pub is a central hub of a community, and expanding it out into, and basically involving women and children as well. You know, I live in Fife and Crossgates, and we've got there's a great sense of community there, and there's community woodland and that kind of thing. You know, taking it away from traditional, that's the pub and it's just the men that go there kind of thing. That's off the top of my head. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
It's really helpful. Jackie, there's a question specifically about the licensing function and being a bit clearer about kind of what do you mean by centralization of licensing? Do you want to answer that one?
I actually would maybe throw that ball back to you, Eric, because I think that was you who raised that to me writing up the report. But yes, I don't know if you want to take it.
Yeah, it wasn't about kind of taking away local responsibility. It was about having a stronger national overarching function, kind of looking at how you can regulate licensing at a local level, and make sure that it's that the public health component of the licensing laws are actually kind of implemented properly. So it was absolutely not about taking away local responsibility, but giving it more of a backbone with a national structure. Yep. Anyone else want to come in? Jardine, do you want to come in relation to the point that Phil was raising?
Yeah, I was just going to, you know, maybe give more examples off the back of what Kevin was saying. I remember I worked in Forth Valley, helping to create a recovery community. Now, we didn't have much funding, so by necessity, we had to really grow into the local community to develop the project. But that became a fabulous idea. The Recovery Rambles grew into an active recovery outdoor scene. So again, we got involved with local projects and doing landscaping, path building, stuff like that, you know. And what was incredible, I remember walking down, we were out for the day in Edinburgh, a really quiet man who'd been coming around to the recovery community for quite a number of weeks, but very, very quiet man, wouldn't really open up. And I was walking down the Royal Mile with him, and he looked down at the ground, as was his wont, but he looked over at me and he said, "I probably quarried these flags." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm a stonemason." And by the end of our walk down the Royal Mile, the man was telling me all about, you know, being a stonemason, and he taught people how to do dry stain diking and stuff like that. Well, you know, fast forward 6 months, we were up in the Ochils, and he was leading a work party, a bunch of people in recovery, helping out to refurbish the track, you know, going up from the back of one of the mills into one of the glens in the Ochils. And that's the kind of example of, you know, taking recovery, based in community and having an asset-based approach, an insight into fun in life and fulfillment in life is much more deep and fulfilling if it's happening anywhere but a pub, you know, because at best, alcohol is just a shortcut to pleasant emotions at best, you know. The genuine article, it's not only better for you, but it's longer lasting and you know, it's much more fulfilling.
Great. Thank you, Jardine. There's a question from Viv Brown. Viv, I can't see you, but it says, what do people think about men's sheds? I'd like to know what they are. I don't know what a men's shed is. So maybe
men's sheds are community-based projects where men can get together as an alternative to going to the pub and do different activities, talk about things like Jardine was just talking about, things that are important to themselves and their identities. And they've spread out quite a lot across Scotland, actually. And they bring together men of different ages as well, which is quite important. And men really support each other, totally run by volunteers and grassroots groups.
Thank you. Can I ask, how do you make men's sheds cool? Because that seems to be one of the fundamentals of this, is that if the social norm is that men go to pubs and hang around in the bar with their dysfunctional friends, how do you change that so that they have functional relationships in non-alcoholic contexts? Anyone? David, you've been chatting. Do you want to, David Barber, do you want to answer that one, and maybe anything else you've got to offer?
I'm not sure if I've got a solution on how to make it cool, particularly for younger people, maybe. But yeah, just the thing I was saying in the chat, which Jardine had was sort of covering as well, was just when I'm speaking. So I work with Glasgow Council on Alcohol, and if I'm speaking, I try to get it across to young people. It sometimes maybe is easier with slightly older individuals, just to get them to think about things they used to enjoy doing when they were younger children, when they were in the early adolescence, and how much fun they used to have doing it. So I'm in recovery as well from alcoholism, and when I was a kid, I used to enjoy doing theatre, amateur drama. I used to enjoy reading books an awful lot more, going to art classes, things like that. And I stopped doing all this stuff to go to the pub all the time, and that was so. Maybe there's something we can do there in terms of, like, people say people who don't drink are boring, whereas actually the solution to a social, what we're going to do tonight, and it's always, well, pub, which it's kind of is what people do a lot. It's like, oh, we'll go to the pub, fancy going to the pub, want to go for a pint. Isn't that boring? Isn't that lacking imagination when there's so much stuff you could be doing and you will really enjoy it? And used to really enjoy it when you were a kid, and all the laughs you think you have when you're drinking with friends, didn't you used to laugh just as much with your friends when you were a child? And if it's the laughter and the fun that you want, then you already got it before without alcohol. So it's trying to emphasize that to people, I think. I'll not mention the other thing that I'd mentioned unless it comes up again, Eric, which was the LGBT stuff, but I see Jackie wants to come in.
It seems to me that one of the things is also kind of challenging these perceived social norms, which may actually not be the norm as well. So it's kind of research that I was previously involved with about drug users. Is that all the drug users who are in nightclubs who are doing drugs think that everyone does drugs, but they don't. It's their friends who are doing drugs because they're hanging around with people who do the same things that they do. So I think kind of challenging those social norms that everyone else is doing these unhealthy things that you're doing, when in actual fact they're not. Loads of people are actually kind of doing loads of really healthy things and not harming themselves, whether it's with alcohol or drugs. Jackie, were you trying to come in to respond to that? No. Katherine, then, can I invite you in? Katherine, you were going to talk a wee bit about the concept of professional optimism, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I suppose this was in response to Phil Kane's request for, what can we all take away from this? What can we do if we're not necessarily a practitioner or a policy official? And I think that as a community, we're here together because we're all interested in tackling alcohol harm in one way or another. And I think perhaps as a community, we should reflect on our optimism when we are drawing attention to rates of harm. I think that as a member of advocacy coalitions, I'm often trying to raise awareness of the fact that alcohol harm as a problem is getting worse, and that deaths are increasing, hospital admissions are increasing, etc. But perhaps that by painting such a negative picture and without drawing attention to the potential positive outcomes and recovery journeys that people go on, we're almost entrenching some of the stigmatization of people who are faced with alcohol dependency and other substance misuse issues, and making it seem like it almost easier for policymakers to write this group off as a problem group that's the problem's too difficult to solve. Perhaps if we shifted some of our focus into being more positive and talking more about supportive opportunities and sharing excellent personal testimonies from people with lived experience, perhaps that might be a more positive route into influence decision makers thinking and practitioners. So that was my 2 pennies worth on how we as a community can maybe rethink how we frame alcohol harm as an issue.
Thank you very much. I see there have been a plethora of responses in relation to men's sheds in the meantime, and some interesting issues, which include kind of that if we're actually creating social spaces, even within our organisation, that we need to pay attention to broader things that have been going on in society and people's experiences, including for LGBT people, if their experience of heterosexual men has been problematic. That needs to be taken into consideration in terms of how we look at addressing and bringing people in. We can't assume that because we set up a space, everyone can necessarily access that space. Justina Murray, do you want to just introduce yourself, Justina, as well, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Justina Murray, CEO of Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs. I'm actually going to unusually ask a not family related question, which I know will surprise most of you. But as we were saying right at the start, the whole alcohol and gender discussion is often reduced to being about alcohol and women. And today, or through this whole programme, the report, it's about alcohol and men. But as the reflections covered at the beginning, it's really all about gender relationships and how men and women interact. And so there's kind of recommendations, I suppose, for both men and women, as well as the recommendations in the report for policy and research and services. So this is probably the only time in my life I am going to ask this of the male panel members. But what are your recommendations for women coming from this report? What should women do differently that would help men sort of reinvent themselves into the space we're talking about today?
Okay, Ian, you've got your hand up. Is that to respond to this question? So you're silenced.
Sorry, that was some time ago. I would put a hand up talking about the pub culture, because it's very different in many other parts of the UK, and almost to the extent that we praise the pubs for being a place for people to meet. You have to have quite a lot of money to get drunk in a pub compared to buying white cider at 8.4% for £3 for 3 litres. So, but on the other hand, it's very much part of the Scottish culture, and I think it's something that's not possibly what we've been told about is not easily transferable to other parts of the UK. And as to the role of how women can support men, again, I think this may be quite culturally specific, and so I think I will dodge that one for Scottish resident to answer.
Okay, does somebody else want to answer how women can forget about themselves and spend their time on supporting men to change their behaviours? I'm being sarcastic, Justine, I don't really mean that. But does somebody want to kind of say how...
We're not going to forget about ourselves, I think you know that.
Jardine, how can women support men's behaviours?
I think it's a great question. and it's because it's such a good question. It's one I'd actually value doing some thinking on. I suppose I'm actually thinking back to when I became a father. Now, I knew I had an alcohol problem by that time, and fatherhood for me was going to be a time where I made changes in my life, because, you know, I had to provide for my wife and for my son. And because I did not address my issues with substances, it actually compounded my sense of self-hate, lack of self-worth, you know, all of that kind of thing. My partner was great in including me, and I loved it, you know, doing the physical care and the bonding stuff. But psychologically for me, I was driving a white van to provide for my wee family, and that wasn't the way life was supposed to go for me. And so that affected me. I suppose, to go back to Justina's question, I don't know if it is in the gift of womanhood to encourage men to open up. I think we need to be able to create safe, respectful and understanding environments where men are encouraged to do that. Do you know what I mean, Justina? But certainly after about a year of being a macho 12-stepper in recovery, I remember actually a fantastic lady, not very far from where I'm sitting, actually, in the East End of Glasgow, quietly coming up to me, taking me by the elbow. You know, one of these white-haired assassins that you get in Glasgow AA meetings, taking me by the elbow and guiding me into a corner and just telling me, listen, son, you've got all the patter, right? We know that. Just shut up and listen to what's been said and you might learn something. And from that moment on, you know, I thought, I'm here to learn, and I'm not doing any learning if I'm spraffing away. You can see that guidance didn't really settle too deeply on me, right enough. But when I did do that and I started to listen, that's when I realised I was learning, and maybe that's when my shares became much more personally authentic rather than following the party line, as it was, you know, of the kind of macho culture of the AA meetings I was going to. So maybe I think that is worth certainly me having a think about, Justina.
Thanks, Jardine. There are a number of people who've got their hands up. Ian and Justina, have you still got your hands up, or should they be down? No, they're down. Charlie, can I ask you to kind of come in? I don't know whether you were responding to Justina.
No, it was general, but it touches on what Christina was talking about. A big thank you, first of all, Eric, Jackie and the SHAAP team for producing this report. I've really been enjoying the interactions. The emphasis that the Scottish Government is putting on peer support and mentorship, I've never seen before in the years I've been involved in this field, and it's been raised here, the efficacy that there is within that. And I think Kevan, touching on the breaking down of, you know, these stereotypical things that are happening, I would love to see the government, and particularly treatment centres, etc., engaging more in embracing the value and the expertise of lived experienced people. I had the privilege last week of, for the first time in months, having a face-to-face talk with patients in LEAP, the rehabilitation centre in Edinburgh. And there's only 11 patients in because the premises they had have been lost. Hopefully they'll get them back. And the appreciation that these folks had with someone coming in to talk to them on an empathic, non-judgmental basis was remarkable. See the energy change within them, that they weren't just sort of put away in a corner somewhere, that there was interested people, interested parties. So really, you know, I think you've done a wonderful job within SHAAP and other agencies. With regards to what Justina was saying very quickly, there were 3 women out of those 11 patients and they were interacting on an excellent basis with the men and holding their own and speaking about their issues and what was going on for them. And I think it's perhaps not recognised, particularly within fellowship situations, that the interactions of the genders really become a parity basis, because there is that issue which we have in common, whether it be drugs, alcohol, etc. But thank you so much for putting this on.
Thank you. Thanks. It's always good to see you, Charlie, as well. Can I ask Relica, are you able to come in? Relica is a colleague from WHO, who maybe you can kind of, you're having this strange insight into Scottish and UK culture. Any kind of reflections about how this compares to Estonia or Germany? You have to unmute yourself. Yep.
Yes, thank you. So I think this is a little bit difficult for me to evaluate. I have been away from Estonia for like 15 years. And as an economist, I'm rather very familiar with all the research done in this area. But what I wanted to say is that I enjoyed every minute of the sessions, because it's like, as a researcher, I think that we quite often lack the aspect of like real people, or people who are actually influenced by either the policies or alcohol itself. So this has been for myself a very important issue, where I also try to communicate quite a lot as a researcher with policymakers in Estonia, for example. And I still think it's very important to actually listen to people who have been through different things, what we are talking about, because quite often as a researcher, you sit behind a desk and you're talking about something you actually have no idea about, right? So I think seminars like that are very important, and thank you very much for inviting me again.
Thank you. Good to have you here. So can I take just as we're beginning to finish off, can I take each of the speakers in turn? Not in the same turn. I'm going to take Habib first, because you've been trying to get in and responding to Justina. So maybe I take Habib first and then Ian. So Habib.
Yeah, just very quickly responding to Justina's question. It's quite a tough one, I think, because I don't know whether you're asking if there's something in particular that women could do. I don't think there is, though. But I think it's a kind of it's an issue that when you're in groups, that regardless of what sex you are, just kind of being more sensitive to maybe people who aren't so keen on consuming alcohol in quite the same ways as others. So, you know, everybody will come to, you know, a group. Say if you're in a group setting, everybody will come to that with a different approach as to how they might want to enjoy themselves with or without alcohol, and just kind of appreciate that and not kind of make people do things that they don't want to do. I think that's a message for I think it's a universal message. I think it's a message for everyone. So yeah.
Thank you. Ian, are you still with us? I can't see you. No, I think we may have lost him. Jardine, do you want to make some kind of final comments? Oh, no, we've got Ian back. Ian, do you want to come in? You need to unmute.
Sorry, I was having some technical problems. I tried phoning Katherine to tell her that I couldn't get through, but I'm through now. No, I've no specific comments, except, you know, I just, how interesting I found it that the sort of the culture is so very different in, you know, in the city pubs in Glasgow compared to you know, leafy Somerset or somewhere. And I think we have to remember that when we're looking at policies or looking at solutions, we can't just assume that the problems is that, and the solution is the same for every area, just as it's not the same for every gender or age group. You asked earlier on whether, you know, had anybody else looked at this? Well, I've actually spoken at 2 conferences on men and alcohol. And I think they've been arranged really through the British Association of Urological Surgeons, because urologists tend to deal predominantly with men. I'm also writing a chapter at the moment in a textbook of mental health about alcohol and men. So there is a wider interest, and I'm pleased that you're adding to that.
Thank you, Ian. Jardine?
I think usually when I attend seminars or webinars like this, and there's a sense of a collective agreement, I get rather frustrated. But in this case, I'm actually very encouraged. I'm thinking especially of what Katherine said around the whole idea of as a collective advocacy voice, we can start to think about how we frame the whole issue of alcohol harms, rather than being admonishing or highlighting the negative. Maybe thinking about, you know, the counterpoint, the operational transcendent process that is available in order to leverage change. And on that point as well, I'm also very encouraged by Scottish Government's approach that in this very, very difficult time, and it's going to get worse economically, and obviously alcohol harms, substance use, inequalities and austerity are really, it's a ticking time bomb, and I suppose in some senses we're all waiting for it to go off. Scottish Government have nailed their colours to the mast in terms of lived experience. So, you know, we've been lucky to receive a significant increase to our core grant funding with the specific remit to build more recovery community activity all across Scotland. So again, all of the stuff that many of us have spoken about today in terms of offering that counterpoint or that alternative health, well-being and lifestyle approach, there's going to be more opportunities to provide that.
Well, that's all great. Kevan, can I just ask you to kind of give us some final reflections?
Yeah, just in an answer to Justina, I don't think there's any more that women can do. I think men should, certainly men that have been affected by alcohol, should apologise, and I'd like to take the opportunity to apologise for all men, given our behaviour, and just keep apologising. I mean, it's men that have got the problem here. You know, women they can't do enough for us. I mean, they've propped us up, they've supported us since time immemorial. This toxic masculinity that exists, and I prefer women's company. I love getting asked out for a coffee and just being included in that kind of thing. And you know, there should be more interaction with that. One thing, being a journalist, one thing that I want you just to keep a wee eye on is just the advertising, the whole advertising. What I'm noticing now, it's not so much to do with men and alcohol, but what I'm noticing is big alcohol are finding ways to make it news stories as opposed to actually paying for advertising. They're getting around journalism that way by preying on the weaknesses that are in journalism, particularly with the constraints and lack of staff and that sort of digital thing. And they're going for, so an example would be Johnny Walker launching a website to advertise the new place in Edinburgh, and that's just free advertising. So that's just something that I want you just to keep a wee eye on. But no, this is brilliant. I mean, there's so many like fantastic people involved here, and it gives me a real hope, this report and also this seminar. It's a total privilege to take part. Thanks.
Kevan, thank you. I think that's given back to you in spades from all of us. Thank you very much. I'm really kind of conscious that we do have to finish off. There's some great points being made in the chat room from Tom in relation to how industry understands men's social spaces and takes advantage of that, and also the fact that generation and the life course are important. There are critical moments when men learn from each other, and maybe that's a places we can find out what those places and times and spaces are, and maybe intervene more effectively to promote healthier ways of being. Morag's thanking Jardine in particular for your input. That's fantastic. Katherine, can I just ask you to say something from IAS as we kind of round off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you to everybody. This has been a really excellent discussion, so interesting. And I'm really proud of this report and this collaboration. I think that the recommendations are ambitious and progressive, and they cut across some really, high level philosophical arguments about how we want our society to be structured and ordered. And I just think that this is a really exciting piece of work, and hopefully will be used as a platform for some effective influencing and advocacy moving forward. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been terrific.
Yes, and on behalf of SHAAP, Katherine, can I thank you and IAS for all you do and for the collaboration with you, which is always fantastic. We enjoy every minute of it. Please, can I thank everyone for joining in this afternoon, thanking you for all the people who have worked on this report and contributed to our discussions. Please email us at SHAAP with ideas about what we can do better and what we should focus on next as well. So thank you very much. Take care. Please go off with a bound in your step and kind of and do some recovery rambling. Thank you. Bye-bye.